Chapter 53 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Will Zufall. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens, Chapter 53. Containing the further progress of the plot contrived by Mr. Ralph Nickleby and Mr. Arthur Gride. With that settled resolution and steadiness of purpose to which extreme circumstances so often give birth, acting upon far less excitable and more sluggish temperaments than that which was the lot of Madeline Bray's admirer, Nicholas started, at the dawn of day, from the restless couch which no sleep had visited on the previous night, and prepared to make that last appeal, by whose slight and fragile thread her only remaining hope of escape depended. Although, to restless and ardent minds, morning may be the fitting season for exertion and activity, it is not always at that time that hope is strongest or the spirit most sanguine and buoyant. In trying and doubtful positions, youth, custom, a steady contemplation of the difficulties which surround us, and a familiarity with them, imperceptibly diminish our apprehensions and beget comparative indifference, if not a vague and reckless confidence, in some relief, the means or nature of which we care not to foresee. But when we come fresh upon such things in the morning, with that dark and silent gap between us and yesterday, with every link in the brittle chain of hope to rivet afresh, our host enthusiasm subdued, and cool, calm reason substituted in its stead, doubt and misgivings revive. As the traveller sees farthest by day, and becomes aware of rugged mountains and trackless plains, which the friendly darkness had shrouded from his sight and mind altogether, so the wayfarer in the toilsome path of human life sees, with each returning sun, some new obstacle to surmount, some new height to be attained. Distances stretch out before him which, last night, were scarcely taken into account, and the light which gilds all nature with its cheerful beams seems but to shine upon the weary obstacles that yet lie strewn between him and the grave. So thought Nicholas, with the impatience natural to a situation like his. He softly left the house, and, feeling as though to remain in bed were to lose most precious time, and to be up and stirring were, in some way, to promote the end he had in view, wandered into London, perfectly well, knowing that for hours to come he could not obtain speech with Madeline, and could do nothing but wish the intervening time away. And, even now, as he paced the streets and listlessly looked round on the gradually increasing bustle and preparation for the day, everything appeared to yield to him some new occasion for despondency. Last night the sacrifice of a young, affectionate, and beautiful creature to such a wretch and in such a cause had seemed a thing too monstrous to succeed, and the warmer he grew, the more confident he felt that some interposition must save her from his clutches. But now, when he thought how regularly things went on, from day to day, in the same unvarying round, how youth and beauty died, and ugly griping age lived tottering on, how crafty avarice grew rich, and manly honest hearts were poor and sad, how few they were who tenanted the stately houses, and how many of those who lay in noisome pens, or rose each day and laid them down each night, and lived and died, father and son, mother and child, race upon race, and generation upon generation, without a home to shelter them, or the energies of one single man directed to their aid. How, in seeking not a luxurious and splendid life, but the bare means of a most wretched and inadequate subsistence, there were women and children in that one town divided into classes, numbered and estimated, as regularly as the noble families and folks of a great degree, and reared from infancy to drive most criminals and dreadful trades, how ignorance was punished and never taught, how jail doors gaped and gallows loomed, for thousands urged towards them by circumstances darkly curtaining their very cradles' heads, and, but for which they might have earned their honest bread and lived in peace, how many died in soul and had no chance of life, how many who could scarcely go astray, be they vicious as they would, turned haughtily from the crushed and stricken wretch who could scarce do otherwise, and who would have been a greater wonder Had he or she done well, then even they had done ill. How much injustice, misery, and wrong there was, and yet how the world rolled on, from year to year, alike careless and indifferent, and no man seeking to remedy or redress it, when he thought of all this, and selected from the mass the one slight case on which his thoughts were bent, he felt, indeed, that there was little ground for hope, and little reason why it should not form an atom in the huge aggregate of distress and sorrow, and add one small and unimportant unit to swell the great amount. But youth is not prone to contemplate, and the darkest side of a picture it can shift at will. By dint of reflecting on what he had to do, and reviving the train of thought which night had interrupted, Nicholas gradually summoned up his utmost energy, and, when the morning was sufficiently advanced for his purpose, had no thought but that of using it to the best advantage. A hasty breakfast taken, and such affairs of business as required prompt attention disposed of, he directed his steps to the residence of Madeline Bray, whither he lost no time in arriving. It had occurred to him that, very possibly, the young lady might be denied, although to him she never had been, and he was still pondering upon the surest method of obtaining access to her in that case, when, coming to the door of the house, he found it had been left ajar, probably by the last person who had gone out. The occasion was not one upon which to observe the nicest ceremony. Therefore, availing himself of this advantage, Nicholas walked gently upstairs and knocked at the door of the room into which he had been accustomed to be shown. Receiving permission to enter from some person on the other side, he opened the door and walked in. Bray and his daughter were sitting there alone. It was nearly 3 weeks since he had seen her last, but there was a change in the lovely girl before him which told Nicholas, in startling terms, how much mental suffering had been compressed into that short time. There were no words which can express, nothing with which can be compared, the perfect pallor, the clear transparent whiteness of the beautiful face which turned toward him when he entered. Her hair was a rich, deep brown, but shading that face, and straying upon a neck that rivaled it in whiteness, it seemed by the strong contrast raven black. Something of the wildness and restlessness there was in the dark eye, but there was the same patient look, the same expression of gentle mournfulness, which he well remembered, and no trace of a single tear. Most beautiful, more beautiful perhaps than ever, there was something in her face which quite unmanned him, and appeared far more touching than the wildest agony of grief. It was not merely calm and composed, but fixed and rigid, as though the violent effort which had summoned that composure beneath her father's eye, while it mastered all their thoughts, had prevented even the momentary expression they had communicated to the features from subsiding, and had fastened it there, as an evidence of its triumph. The father sat opposite her, not looking directly in her face, but glancing at her as he talked with a gay air, which ill disguised the anxiety of his thoughts. The drawing materials were not on their accustomed table, nor were any of the other tokens of her usual occupations to be seen. The little vases, which Nicholas had always seen filled with fresh flowers, were empty, or supplied only with a few withered stalks and leaves. The bird was silent, the cloth that covered his cage at night was not removed. His mistress had forgotten him. There are times when, the mind being painfully alive to receive impressions, a great deal may be noted at a glance. This was one, for Nicholas had but to glance around him, when he was recognized by Mr. Bray, who said impatiently, "Now, sir, what do you want? Name your errand here quickly, if you please, for my daughter and I are busily engaged with other and more important matters than those you come about. Come, sir, address yourself to your business at once." Nicholas could very well discern that the irritability and impatience of this speech were assumed, and that Bray, in his heart, was rejoiced at any interruption which promised to engage the attention of his daughter. He bent his eyes involuntarily upon the father as he spoke, and marked his uneasiness, for he colored and turned his head away. The device, however, so far as it was a device for causing Madeline to interfere, was successful. She rose, and, advancing toward Nicholas, paused half-way, and stretched out her hand as if expecting a letter. "Madeline," said her father, "my love, what are you doing?" "Miss Bray expects an enclosure, perhaps," said Nicholas, speaking very distinctly, and with an emphasis she could scarcely misunderstand. My employer was absent from England, or I should have